Once I'd noticed the continuity between UFO experiences and older folklore experiences and realized that these creatures, these beings, were universal. I don't think there's a culture which doesn't believe in some form of fairy, jinn, alien, nymph, and so forth and so forth. I had to think up a general name for them, so I just went to the ancient Greeks, for whom these creatures were commonplace, as we know from Greek myth, and they called them daimons. And so I adopted that. But they knew where the daimons lived. They knew where they came from. It is a whole autonomous realm. And I noticed that was completely analogous to Jung's collective unconscious. So I had all these models. I had all these models of places where the daimons came from, the soul of the world, the collective unconscious. And I could see that these were all analogous to each other, but the daimons that inhabit these places, these realms, these states of mind, however you wish to characterize them, they changed their shape to suit the times. So what were once fairies are now so-called aliens from so-called outer space, but I think they're from the same realm.
What if the UFO phenomena, fairy lore, entities, angels, demons, even religious experiences are not primitive misunderstandings of reality, but misreadings of something real that lies beyond the physical? This is exactly what author Patrick Harpur argues. In his now classic book, as far as I'm concerned, Daimonic Reality, Harpur argues that the deeper reality is not physical, but imaginal. That science and materialism didn't explain away the paranormal, it simply flattened it. It blinded us to the deeper layers of reality. But this is not about naively believing in any particular alien race or flavor of entity or spirit. This is about awakening to a deeper truth about reality itself. One where even experiences are symbolic, synchronistic, intelligent, and deeply psychological without being simply imagination. Harpur calls this living, symbolic, synchronistic realm the daimonic. It's the middle point between consciousness and matter. So if you've ever felt like UFOs, entities, synchronicities, myths are real, yet real in a way that evades conventional science, I think this mind meld is really going to speak to you, my friends. And with that, let's initiate this mind meld, my friends. But first, make sure you like and that you are subscribed. Also, if you haven't noticed, I am now posting weekly members only / patron content, both on the YouTube members section and at patreon.com / third eye drops. You're going to have occasional full mind melds, Q&As, more stream of consciousness stuff from me. And I guess we'll see what else I conjure. So if you want to give your pal, Michael P., a Christmas gift, sign up over on the members section or at patreon.com / third eye drops. And with that, my friends, let's initiate this mind meld with the brilliant Patrick Harpur. I'm going to start with some much deserved flattery, Patrick, because I think I said something to you when we briefly connected sans video the other day, that one of my favorite things about doing this is being so deep down the panoply of esoteric rabbit holes that I'm personally down, and then finding out that someone like you exists that essentially exemplifies or deepens all of those rabbit holes. And you are that person, my friend. You're absolutely that person. So I'm very excited for this conversation.
Okay.
I would say one of the chief reasons for that is that you are a champion of, I think, what we could throw a lot of monikers at, this sort of mythopoetic worldview, the imaginal, the daimonic, the Western esoteric, and all of these things are topics that I'm deeply, deeply interested in. And I know you talk about, sort of growing up in this milieu of understanding that there are things like nature spirits and fairies and strange things that happen out in the world. But when did you really come into contact with what you grew to call this daimonic worldview, and what were some of your biggest influences there?
Well, I don't know. I think from a child I was just interested in marvelous events and supernatural happenings, and I wasn't ever dissuaded from doing this. And despite a very expensive education, which attempted to drum this interest out of me, it persisted, and and so I started. Yes, I mean I've said before that it part of it was that my father, who's Irish, had seen fairies and spoke about that as a
Mm-hmm.
matter of course. Really, it's quite a normal thing to see if you were Irish, and so and my mother was as I've said before, my mother was a keen spiritualist, so she was always off to mediums, talking to the dead. Especially as her mother, my grandmother, had been a very fine medium. Did some wonderful automatic writing was her
Mm-hmm.
favorite thing, and so yeah, so I had a background in which wacky stuff was quite normal for me, and so on. So I didn't really begin to, let's say, study it until I decided to write my book about UFOs and alien abductions. Alien abductions were the key thing, really, around 89 or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, they became very fashionable, and I thought, yeah, this is a step too far. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. Well, needless to say, I never did get to the bottom of it, but I did shoot a good shot at it in my book, Daimonic Reality,
Yeah.
and so that's where it started. And for that, I had to do a lot of research and so on. So back in the day when there was no internet, I had to take notes from books I got out of libraries. It was a very laborious business. There was no
Mm-hmm.
cutting and pasting then. So that's how it started, really. Um, but
Yeah.
I'd always, but having read English literature at university, I was also interested in poetic vision and in mystical experiences and so on. So I'd gone up a gear as well, not just the wild and wacky things, but the more orthodox notions of how it is that we can see into the other world or travel into the other world, or what kind of vision is required to see into the other world. I
Yeah.
use the other world loosely as the folklorists use it, of course. So that's how it started, really, Michael. Yeah.
Beautifully set up, and there's so many threads that I'm tempted to follow, from more specifics about some of these experiences that your family had. I'm so curious if you yourself had any of those experiences, but two, before I forget, that's such a fascinating and fun, wonder inducing element of diving down these rabbit holes, to me, is when intelligent people come into these topics like UFO abductions, like the supernatural, like the unseen realm, and think, I'm going to solve this. And then whether it's you or it's John Mack or it's Jacques Vallée, they all kind of change their tune eventually and realize maybe it's not as simple as there being, beings from here who are simply getting in a spaceship and messing with people, right? Or taking samples from people. Maybe there is some element of that, but there's also something psychological, metaphysical, daimonic, um, imaginal, if you really want to capture the totality of what's going on. And the words go on,
Yeah.
symbolic, um,
It was
it,
one of the things
yeah.
that slightly got on my nerves was that during the great UFO debates of the late 80s and early 90s, it seemed to me that the only point of view permissible was sort of the scientific point of view, and that kind of slightly got on my nerves because I was you know people didn't seem to be very well versed in the humanities.
Right.
That's to say, in all the literature in which things analogous to UFOs and abductions were commonplace. That as far as I know, only Jacques Vallée had noticed that UFO abductions were completely continuous with things like fairy abductions, and indeed abductions by daimonic beings all over the world. I mean, the jinns will take you.
Hmm.
You know, the Amazon nymphs will take you. So And I just thought, this is getting on my nerves. I'll stick some of the humanity knowledge into this. I think people forget that the humanities are much more important than science, because the humanities deal with the human condition as such, whereas science doesn't. It's much more specialized, and scientists, for all their brilliance, are not generally well versed in general thinking. So that was part of it. I wanted to bring a more poetic and literary perspective onto anomalous phenomena, which were being completely ignored. People were taking UFOs literally in a way that which previous peoples would never have done, and indeed other peoples on the face of the earth today, tribal peoples, never do. So yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would also add, did you dive into any John Keel during your research and his whole ultra terrestrial hypothesis?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I benefited greatly from. I had a whole section on John Keel and his quest that he outlines in Operation Trojan Horse,
Yeah.
which is fascinating. The way in which he enters a kind of psychic space in which people are phoning him from all over the country, and in which he's being pursued by cars which disappear,
Mhm.
where, where he where he answers the phone one day and it's himself on the other end of the line. I mean, things get wild in John
Yeah.
Keel's world. So I was very, very taken up by that and interested in it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you and I both know that when you start playing in these waters, the trickster does show up in these ways. Synchronicities start happening, things you can't explain. You're not sure if you're paranoid or if these things are really happening or if you're assigning meaning to these things that are totally random. And that's kind of what you sign up for when you go into these realms that are outside of the ordinary. I'm curious if there are any instances like that that stand out to you in investigating these things. Like there's so many stories from. I mean, I have personal stories from Jung, stories from Keel, stories from Jacques Vallée. It seems like everybody, eventually has things like this happen to them.
Yes, yes. Nothing dramatic happened to me. Although the the point about researching a book is that it becomes a kind of a quest, and once you're on a quest, then all sorts of psychic weirdness becomes constellated, and so your world starts to be filled with as you say, synchronicities and weird things. The only things that I experienced were a despair at ever finding the right reference for something or the right book, and it landing on my doorstep or on my lap, from
Hmm.
someone sends it to me, it falls off a shelf in the library in front of me, that sort of thing. But all researchers know that experience. A friend of mine, John Michel, the great inventor of the New Age, he called it the library angel, in which
Mm,
you look at the millions of books, you think, I'll never find the right book, and then it falls off the shelf. So yes, that sort of thing definitely happened to me. But I never went into, thank God, I never went down John Keel's rabbit hole.
yeah, yeah. So I obviously you've been asked this question so many times, but I think it would behoove us to riff on this a little bit. What is the daimonic reality to you? And why do you think it's important to start looking back into the history of esotericism? How did you land on the Greek terminology for the sort of um, unseen intermediary sort of not just presence, but really whole field of beings that they believed exists between us and the sort of higher realms?
Yes, well, as I said, once I'd noticed the continuity between kind of UFO experiences and older folklore experiences, fairy experiences, and so on. And once I'd read quite extensively in anthropology and realized that these creatures, these beings, were universal. I don't think there's a culture which doesn't believe in some form of fairy, jinn, alien, nymph,
Mhm.
satyr, Quai Shin, Yunwetsunsi amongst the Cherokees, and so forth and so forth. I had to think up a general name for them, so I just went to the ancient Greeks, for whom these creatures were commonplace, as we know from Greek myth, and they called them daimons. And so I adopted that. Um, but I also noticed in amongst the Greeks that they knew where the daimons lived. They knew where they came from, and they called that place the soul of the world, which is a very beautiful name for this place. It's better than, for example, another dimension or other planets or whatever. Um, so yeah, so the Greek worldview was a great help to me. So I merely adopted that as a signifier for this kind of reality. But daimonic reality is well, the soul of the world is another analogous realm to it, and so on. The folklorists call it the other world, and I'm very much like that, as I indicated earlier. I like the idea that the other world suggests a concrete place, not a literal place, you note, but a concrete place. And I think perhaps more intellectually, I identified it with the romantic imagination. Um, for the Romantics, the imagination was pretty much the opposite of the way we use the word today. It's not just a faculty of being able to make things up or to picture things that aren't present to the senses. It is a whole autonomous realm. And I noticed that was completely analogous to Jung's collective unconscious. So I had all these models. I had all these models of places where the daimons came from, the soul of the world, the romantic imagination, the collective unconscious, and I could see that these were all analogous to each other. They were all rewriting each other and reinventing the wheel each time. But the daimons that inhabit these places, these realms, these states of mind, however you wish to characterize them, that they remained constant, although they naturally changed their shape to suit the times. So what were once fairies are now so-called aliens from so-called outer space, but I think they're from the same realm, from the deep imagination, or from, and that's what Jung had a huge influence on me in this regard, because, and he called daimonic reality simply psychic reality. As far as I can see, that they're more or less the same thing. That it is this in-between world which participates in matter and spirit at the same time, and that's the real conundrum, the real contradiction that daimons present to us. But they all have the same characteristics. They're elusive, marginal, always marginal, or not just topographically. They appear in marginal places, like Bigfoot on a tree line, or a fairy on a seashore, or a black dog on a bridge. These are liminal zones, liminal places, but they're also marginalized by every mainstream culture. So every attempt to bring them into the mainstream always fails, really, or else if they're brought into the mainstream, it's not the real thing. They've already slipped away and they're on the margins again somewhere else. They always shapeshift, and they shapeshift not just in space but across time. Hence, what used to be fairies are now aliens, and so forth. They're always tricksters that you can't predict. They're sublime, but also ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's the absurdity of them that people can't get their heads around. But a worldview that doesn't take the continuum from absurdity to the sublime into consideration is, I think, falsifying reality. I think we have to take that into account, and so on. Those are the main things. They're always ambiguous, always contradictory. That they can be both benevolent or malign. Christianity took them literally, and when you take a thing literally, you have to split it into black and white. You have to polarize it. So they became angels and devils. But the original diamonds have both aspects compacted within them. and so on. Their worst contradiction, of course, is, from our point of view, is that they appear both ethereally, immaterially, and materially. And that is a real stumbling block, because one of the great vices of modernity is that we mistake the material for the literal. Um, but it's the world of matter is no more literal than the world of spirit. You
Right.
know
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
know, and so a daimon could very well give you a nasty hard smack. They don't usually do more than that, I have to say. The fairies will give you a stroke, which is where we get the word
Mm.
from. Yeah,
Oh, really?
yeah. We still talk about a stroke, but
Hmm.
originally it was a fairy stroke because they could make you go doolally,
Oh,
make you go senseless.
wow.
Or sometimes you remember you used to say, "Oh, he's touched in the head."
Yeah.
Well, that was a reference to the fairy touch.
Mm.
A fairy could just touch you and it would make you a bit senseless. But we see the same disorientation, nausea, dizziness, sickness in UFO encounters. The aliens will give you a little blast from their ray guns,
Yeah.
and it's a bit like the fairy stroke. um, so they do that and they leave traces, but the traces are just as mysterious as the phenomenon, really.
Hmm.
That's the trouble, that they're not separate from the phenomenon, they're continuous with it. And so it's I would recommend the study of UFOs to anybody, simply because in order to get any kind of handle on them whatsoever, you have to study psychology,
Yeah.
folklore, mythology, science, philosophy, theology. In the end, you have to study just about everything to even get a handle on them. And even then, naturally, they elude you because they are perennially elusive. The last characteristic, which is very interesting, is Socrates' idea that the daimons
Yeah.
mediate between us and the gods,
Hmm.
and he said they convey the wishes of men to the gods and the will of gods to men. Um, I don't know to what extent we can say that if so-called aliens are really daimons. I'm not quite sure how they mediate between us and the gods,
Yeah.
except perhaps in the way that I've mentioned, that they kind of invite you to pursue them, and you end up questioning the very nature of reality itself. But in that sense, it does leads you through the soul of the world, the great realm, Platonic realm of nous.
Hmm. Yes. Yes. Yes.
So in that sense, they are perhaps mediators. Yeah.
Yeah, and also in a lot of these experiences, how are they communicating? They're communicating psychically, right? Which again has this huge overlap with what you were saying about, fairy lore and being touched in the head, and literally types of communication that are non-physical, but they're an instant knowing. And there's this familiarity there that you hear about from a lot of experiencers as well, and I find this to be true. I've never had like an alien abduction classical experience at all. All of my experiences have come from either, doing a lot of meditation or altering my mind with like a tryptamine or something like that. But I will say one of the common overlaps between all of these things, whether it's encountering what you perceive to be an other being, an alien, a fairy, etc., or it's altering your mind and feeling like you've reconnected with some other realm, other senses, other intelligence, is there's a sense of familiarity there that really harmonizes with what you're saying in the way that it demonstrates that, oh, I already know this. I already have been here this whole time. Just somehow my access to this was cut off, or my ability to use this faculty was cut off. But now that it's turned back on somehow, it's all familiar. It's like the platonic anamnesis moment where you suddenly remember, of course the world soul is real. Of course I'm in this reality that includes non-physical things just as much as it includes physical things. And really this whole illusion between inner and outer, or I jumped the gun by saying illusion too early. Really, this whole distinction between inner and outer is an illusion, and there really is no difference. But then, of course, once you go back to consensus reality and regular metacognition, like I'm Patrick, I'm Michael, I'm in this world, that thing is separate from me. You lose access to that yet again, and it becomes this almost dreamlike thing that you found yourself in, and you kind of know is real, but it also becomes a story you tell yourself until you gain access to that reality again. Um, so I'm so curious if you have had what your most impactful personal experiences with waking up to that kind of reality was.
Um, I don't think I think I had it quite young.
Hmm.
In fact, I think I had it in my very first memory,
Wow.
and I don't think I ever lost it. Easy as that.
Wow. Yeah, in some ways I relate. I have really early memories of at night. Like what I think most people would say, "Oh, you're having nightmares or you're imagining things." But I've begun to think about this more and more lately. As I've not just gotten into these things, but as I've just gotten older, and I think it's equally plausible that it's just the opposite. That as we get older, we lose access to our ability to sort of peek through the veil. And maybe when you're younger, you're just having totally natural experiences of the veil thinning at night when your brain waves are moving more slowly and you're closer to the dream realm or the other world or whatever you want to call it. Um, and maybe it's more of a matter of it being sort of programmed out of us or extracted out of us than it is um, us ever actually gaining or losing access to it. Maybe it's more of a fact that we convince ourselves that we don't have access to it, but really we do, and there's no. Yeah,
I think we're just sort of educated out of it. It's just
yeah,
we're educated into the modern worldview, but children don't. They're too young to have a worldview. The world still presents it to themselves, to them as they're living more in the realm of imagination before that's been frowned on and stamped out of them. And the world of imagination, there's that fluidity between the mind and the so-called external world. In which I remember there was a TV program on in England in which they set up some. It was one of those kind of candid camera type programs, and they set up some children who were told to just use crayons and draw a picture, and they were sitting at a desk full of objects, and one of the objects was a kind of a little furry toy, but it was an animatronic one. They rigged it and they made this creature. It suddenly talks to the child and it says, "Hi there, what are you doing?" And the child says, "Oh, I'm just drawing." Child just completely takes it in its stride. I thought this is awful cheat, really. I hope it didn't damage the child forever when it learned
yeah.
that this was in fact. But, and the child chatted away quite happily, barely looking up at this creature because, it was just part of the furniture, and you expected things to talk to you,
Mhm.
Um, and I thought that was very telling. So yes,
Absolutely.
they live in they, but all too soon, we're taught that this can't happen. Well, in the television case, it didn't happen, but things do address us. I remember talking to plants as a tiny child, because they
Yeah,
spoke to me. You know,
yeah, absolutely.
I can't
I
remember what they said, but yeah. I'd be quite happy talking to anything, really.
I have a friend who just did a 4-day sort of Native American style vision quest where he was fasting both, no food or and no water. Really a pretty risky thing to do, and it was during a pretty hot time of the year. And he said by day 2 or day 3, anytime a butterfly would show up, anytime a bird would show up, he instantly had this feeling like that thing was communicating with him. And it wasn't, in the cliche sort of Disney cartoon kind of way where it's literally coming up to you and speaking English, of course. It's sort of like an instant um symbolic knowing that, to me, as someone who's into not just folklore, but also Western esotericism, where, as you know, another feature of this worldview is that everything in nature is some kind of token or sign or symbolon, or they called synthemata of some divinity. And in that way, like, yes, a plant is carrying some kind of deeper symbolic message. A bird is carrying some kind of deeper symbolic message. And again, we've just not only lost our creativity in our symbolic imagination, but I think we really have had that extracted from our worldview. Um, and the world soul is a key part of that way of seeing as well, because if the world has a soul, then everything within the world is ensouled, and it's part of this larger uh um sort of fabric of soul that
Yeah,
extends. Yeah.
but that's just what human beings have always. I mean, I tend to believe that what anthropologists call animist cultures was probably the culture of humanity for most of its existence, for
Yes.
probably 200,000 years or more. Um, that this wasn't we call it a worldview, but it wasn't, of course, it was the world. They saw the world as containing everything contained in the world had a soul. Um, that they that 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 everything came at them as persons. Trees and plants and animals were persons to them, ensouled persons, not humans. Humans are just one kind of soul amongst many. Um, and that seems to me, and so you can abstract from that a philosophical principle called the soul of the world, but you're already at one remove from the actual experience of living in an animist culture. Such an unpleasant word, animist, really. I mean, they just saw the whole world as diamond ridden in the first instance, that is their world that they live in. And anthropologists have only recently come to accept that, the great ontological turn in anthropology in the 90s and so on. They
Hmm.
thought, what if this is in fact a world, and it's real, and you know and that we can stop looking down on these so-called primitive cultures, towards which we are infinitely more superior because we're technologically more proficient. Um, and so that can only be a good thing, really. But yes, I think it strikes children. The world strikes children as being ensouled, and we can recover that feeling. I think we can recover that kind of attitude towards the world in which all other beings are as sacred as we are. We've lost that sense of the outside world being sacred. In fact, they don't even conceive of the world as outside in the way that we do. They don't
Hmm.
have that Cartesian dualism and so on. You'd have to go to long perorations about the history of thought and the rise of the scientific method and so on to realize how naturalism overtook our natural animism and so on.
Yeah.
Although, uh, the animism, while it's the default world of most tribal cultures and so on, the refinement of it, there's a refinement of it which is analogism, as the anthropologists call it, and that was a world, or worldview if you prefer, um, that pertained in India, China, amongst the Greeks in the ancient world, and in Western Europe until about 1600. Shakespeare inhabited the analogist world, and that's why in plays like King Lear, when King Lear has gone mad and is raging on the blasted heath, um, he talks about the storm mirroring his mind as his mind mirrors the storm. I mean, that is
Yeah.
the natural way of describing our psychic states is through, weather events, hurricanes and tornadoes and so on. But there was no division he still lived in that participatory universe. He was just on the cusp before we became self-reflected. The heroic ego rose up, the Puritans and so on, and we separated ourselves in the Cartesian fashion from a world outside. But before that, we were embedded in the world. We participated in the outside world. It reflected us as we reflected it. We were microcosms in relation to a macrocosm. That's to say, we were a small cosmos in relation to a larger cosmos. But we are nested in each other, so that what is outside is in, and what is in is outside, and hence synchronicities were merely a way of life in
Yeah.
those days. I mean, King Lear and the Storm, we call that a synchronicity, but no, it was just a fact of life.
Yeah.
And synchronicities now, I think, just are just things that remind us that this is perhaps a more truthful way of regarding ourselves in relation to the world. That
Yeah.
we've become too cut off. Does that make
Yeah.
sense, Michael?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And speaking of cusps and the illusion between inner and outer and liminal zones and synchronicities, the patron deity, really the arch daimonic figure, is this mysterious figure of Hermes, Mercury, Mercurius. We were just talking about, you have a caduceus behind you. I happen to have a caduceus shirt on today. I'd be lying if I said that wasn't calculated, though. Um, and this figure is so fascinating to me for so many reasons. And as soon as you start studying Western esotericism, you hear about Hermeticism. You see the influence on this Hermes Mercury figure on the Neoplatonists. Like, if you achieve nerdy enough status where you start reading Iamblichus and On the Mysteries, I think the very first line in On the Mysteries is him paying homage to Hermes, saying that anybody who's into the divine science, philosophy, writing is doing the work of this Hermes figure. And here we are, well over 1,000, 1,500, 1,700 years after him, 2,500 years after Plato, and who knows how long from the beginnings of this archetypal figure, still talking about it, still trying to make sense of it, because it does play at transcendence of concepts, right? It's it's part of the idea that you were trying to communicate before, about there being no difference between the inner and the outer. And of course, as you well know, one of the best ways to try to wrap your mind around this concept is through the magnum opus of alchemy, of transforming something from the prima materia into the rubedo, and all of the incredibly difficult to convey things that seem to happen as part of that process, that are both actually operational in whatever you're working on and mental. And these processes reflect one another in a way that would sound like psychosis to the average modern person, but is in some strange way all part of the grammar of that process. And you explore this thoroughly and incredibly in Mercurius. Um, but I'd love to just hear your reflections on Mercurius in general, and how alchemy kind of personifies all of this.
Yes. Um, well, I think that first of all, alchemy is a specialization. Secondly, it only takes place in an in cultures which subscribe to analogism.
Hmm.
That's why you get it amongst the Greeks, the Chinese, the Indians, the Arabs, those cultures, and lastly in Western Europe. The others all were earlier. Um, and so it only seems to happen at a certain. You have to have an analogistic worldview in which everything is analogous to everything else. Um, for example, a simple example would be that the correspondence between, let's say, iron and Mars and the color red that there are
Hmm.
these chains of correspondences which are
Yeah.
all analogous to each other, but at different horizontal levels, as it were. Um, um, in England, for example, you would have the corresponding symbols would be something like in the plant world a rose, in the animal kingdom a lion, in the human kingdom the king. Do you see what I mean?
Hmm.
These are
Hmm.
all, and so they become symbols of each other, but really they're sort of an analogies of different realms of the plant realm to the animal realm to the human realm and so on. So alchemy seems to just take place at a certain stage in analogistic cultures and so on. That it flourished in China for about 300 years, but then kind of fell into desuetude, and the same amongst the Arabs and so on. We got it from the Arabs. I think the first alchemical text was written in Europe in something like 1120 or something like. I can't remember. I used to know all this stuff.
Yeah, Zosimus, I think by a lot of people is considered to be one of the very first
Yeah,
people.
Zosimus of Panoplis. Yeah,
Yes, yeah.
in Greece. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Um, although his alchemy was, we don't know that much about it, but
Yeah,
it certainly wasn't as refined as the later European, Western European alchemy, and so on. But so it was it is, it only takes place in analogistic cultures, and even then, it's a kind of specialization that it's for the intelligentsia, really.
yeah.
And the idea was that you could accelerate natural processes. That the medieval view of the natural world was that it was all evolving, not in our modern sense, but growing towards a condition of perfection and so on. And the metals themselves were all evolving, and and they were trying to achieve the perfect state of metal, which is
Hmm.
gold, because it's incorruptible. It doesn't end eternal. It doesn't change. It doesn't decay. It's a and that's why people have always prized gold everywhere. Um, and the idea was that you could accelerate this process um, by technical means, um, but the and produce the philosopher's stone, which, when applied to base metal, turned it to gold. But they never said literal gold. They always said philosophical gold. Nobody knows what that is. Nobody knows what anything is when it comes to alchemy. Um, and the corollary of the philosopher's stone was, of course, the elixir of life,
Hmm. Hmm.
which, when we drank it, then that would accelerate our condition to a state of perfection, i.e., a state of incorruptibility and immortality, like gold. That was the idea. This is uh, it's a balmy notion, but it kind of makes sense in the analogistic worldview.
I just thought of something
Yeah.
funny. You could put a pretty clean dichotomy and map these things right over one another. You have people with an alchemy who are only interested in technical alchemy, right? Like they're only interested in the actual alchemical process, working with the metal, literally transforming something else into gold. And then you have people who say, no, no, no. Jung is the ultimate version of this. So no, no, this is all about spiritual, psychological alchemy. It's something within that changes. Isn't that the exact same thing we're experiencing with the UFO phenomenon? It's like you have the people who are obsessed with the nuts and bolts technological part of it, and then you have the people who are obsessed with the mythopoetic, the psychical, the understanding that this probably fits within this larger spiritual framework that we're all living within, and the way that we're talking about it. That should tell us something. I mean, Hermes
Yes.
has to be having a laugh about that one.
Yes. Exactly right. It was Jung who said that the thing about alchemy is it's they don't call themselves alchemists. They say we are philosophers,
Hmm.
or we are scientists, or we are artists. They couldn't quite make up their minds what they were, and the truth is they were all of those things, you know. And it was Jung who said that Paracelsus and Jacob Boehme divided alchemy between them into natural science on the one hand and Protestant mysticism on the other. And the truth is that I had the fanciful notion that the collective unconscious, the primal imagination, was working itself out in alchemy. And that when alchemy fell apart, it fell apart into its constituent strands.
Mm.
It fell apart, on the one hand, into science, just and technical matters, and it fell. On the other hand, it fell apart into mysticism, Protestant mysticism. But Jacob Boehme, all Boehme's imagery is alchemical, but he's a mystic. Whereas Paracelsus was a very hands-on technical curer. He was a
Hmm.
doctor
Hmm.
and worked with plants and herbs and so on to heal, but his worldview was completely alchemical and so on. And I would go further. I would say that the imagery of alchemy also underlay things like the great renaissance of drama in England around the time of Shakespeare. It's Jacobean drama is stuffed with alchemical imagery. There's a wonderful book by Charles Nicholl called The Chemical Theatre, which
Mm.
which analyzes all the alchemical imagery in King Lear, the play I've just referred to, Shakespeare's play. Um, and it seemed to me that the sort of that all the sort of myth-laden gases contained within the hermetic vessel burst asunder and became different strands of modern culture. And we all became specialists in different areas. But alchemy keeps them all compacted together in the one the vessel, one the work, one the stone, the oneness of the work. And yet, paradoxically, of course, it undergoes many stages and so on. So it's both one thing and many things. It's both naturing, as they said, the natural evolution of nature. We're just accelerating nature, but it's also the opus contra naturam, as they used to say, the work against nature. There's something deeply unnatural about alchemy, that it is hard graft, and
Hmm.
and we have to work on intransigent materials and indeed work on ourselves, and so it's just full of these paradoxes, and it alerts us to the fact that, like the daimonic realm, paradox is at the heart of it, and the paradox may well be, at the heart of what I shall boldly call reality.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Yeah. Um, Zooming more in on this figure of Mercurius, this patron deity of alchemy, of the esoteric in many ways. I mean, every Western esoteric lodge organization still calls itself hermetic, right? It's still there. The symbol system is still there that we've been using since I don't know when. I don't know when that symbol system rose to popularity. Like whatever we're using today in terms of planetary symbols and sigils, and I can only guess. Maybe Alexandria, maybe longer ago. Um, and I understand that this is fraught territory to try to even discuss this figure. Yeah, I mean, maybe that one of the best ways to talk about this is the quote that you open up the book with. This warning essentially from Mercurius. I have mine in the other room. I don't know if you happen to have your copy of the book near you. It would
No,
be great. It'd be great to hear you read it.
well, I haven't got it.
Okay. Well, I could go get mine, or I could look it up. Um, let me go grab mine real quick. I'll be right back.
Okay, you sure?
Okay. Sadly for everyone, I don't think there's a good way for Patrick to read from my book. So I'll just read this quick, and then I would love to hear you just generally riff on this.
I don't do riffing.
Isn't that what we're doing?
No, we're conversing in a genteel fashion.
Okay, so it must be at the beginning of the introduction because it's not. Okay. Know this, I, Mercurius, have set down a full, true, and infallible account of the great work, but I give you fair warning that unless you seek the true philosophical gold, and not the gold of the vulgar, unless your heart is fixed with unbending intent on the true stone of the philosophers, unless you are steadfast in your quest, abiding by God's laws in all faith and humility, and eschewing all vanity, conceit, falsehood, intemperance, pride, lust, and faint heartedness, read no further, lest I prove fatal to you. Where does that quote come from?
Comes from Mercurius. He dictated it to me.
Hmm. What do you think he specifically? I mean, he lays out what he's warning against, but how is that relevant to the reader? Who, of course, it's relevant to the perspective alchemist, right? Who's doing this work. And maybe that gives too much of a hint, because I think by reading this book, I think you're maybe unwittingly at first, but you're definitely participating in the work to some degree.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, no, I set out to write a book about alchemy. Once again, I was a bit like Daimonic Reality. I was frustrated by the books I read about alchemy, which I found boring. And yet I was still fascinated by it. What is going on? I had no idea what was going on. And the books about alchemy that I read kind of didn't tell me. So I thought I'd write a novel. Well, no, I thought I'd write I started off writing a novel. It turned into a daimonic book in which half of it is half of it is non-fiction, and half of it is fiction. And people who
Perfect.
guess which is which usually get it wrong. And yes, so I started writing about alchemy, and it became a work of alchemy. Yeah. And as such, it changed me.
Well,
That although I wasn't boiling the metals, I had a man in my book who was boiling the metals, who was doing the stuff. And yeah, my worldview changed. I stopped being a good little, well educated Western Englishman, and I became a mad esoteric philosopher. It turned my world upside down, alchemy. Yeah. And I also understood his warning, because I, many of the alchemists always used to insert in their texts, all the texts are in Latin.
hmm
And I spent quite a long time in the British Library reading the original manuscripts, and translating them. But it became just too arduous in the end. But every now and again they'd say, "Nonnulli perierunt." That's the Latin, means not a few have perished
hmm
in the course of the great work. So the warnings were always there. And only when I was nearing the end of the book did I understand what they meant, really, that it's a kind of madness. You can yes, it really alters your, not just your state of mind, but your state of being, I would say. Yeah. And that was
absolutely.
just writing. Wasn't even doing it. So yes. But strangely, writing a book is a bit like alchemy, because you see, alchemy is a creative process. In that, you see, the alchemists constantly talk about circulations.
hmm hmm
Circulations are, and what a circulation means is the process of reflux distillation. And it's when you have a prime matter in your retort, in your glass retort, and you've established what matter you're working on, and you heat it, and this is the process of distillation. That the water evaporates into a gas. It rises to the top of the metal, where it cools, condenses, and returns to liquid. But it is drained off not as spirit. Um, the history of distilleries is very interesting. They're
Hmm.
called spirits,
Yeah.
strong liquor. But what it is it's refluxed. In other words, it's returned to the matter at the bottom of the glass. So you have, instead of the condensed liquid dripping out in the form of gin or whiskey or whatever, it's returned to the prime matter, and in turn changes and transforms that. So it's a circular process.
Hmm.
And they used to see this as, they call the top of the glass their heaven, for instance. And they watched the soul of the body being the matter, being you'd apply heat to it, the soul would rise, it would be made volatile, then it would become fixed again as it condensed and returned to the original matter. And that seemed to me a perfect metaphor for the way in which artistic activity is carried on. Because while I was writing the book, well, I was constantly circulating and refining, in the sense that I was writing draft after draft, and refining and subliming and the text out of imagination, and then it would condense back into words and so on. And so the whole process of writing or indeed painting a picture is like that. Is the imagination itself, in other words, is is at the heart of alchemy. And that it occurred to me. I mean, I was more than halfway through when I realized that I was engaged. That imagination is a concrete thing. It's like a subtle body, and that's
Mm.
exactly the insight that Jung had.
Mm.
That he read this book called Ruland's Lexicon of Alchemy, which I've got in my shelves, and it said in this book, imagination is the star in man, a subtle body.
Mm. Mm.
And he thought, yes, stat me. Before that moment, he thought, oh, I know what's happening. They're doing chemical things and they're projecting onto it from the unconscious. They're seeing things that are projected from their unconscious minds. So instead of, gas, they're seeing spirit. And instead of, water, they're seeing the prime matter and so on. And he realized that, in fact, at that point, his theory of projection stalled. And he thought, no, that the whole thing is an imaginative process, that in which you start with a prime matter, which we don't know what it is. You then heat it, not with you heat it with actual fire, but the key ingredient is the secret fire. Nobody knows what that is. And the result is a stone, which may well be a literal substance, a tincture, a, a powder, a thing. But in the end, nobody really knows what the stone is either. So I realized that this was all. When they talk about the prime matter, for instance, they say, "Oh, I'm using lead. Others use gold. Others use sulfur. Others use mercury. Some use cloud, sky,
Mm.
sea,
Mm.
darkness." Of course, these are all archetypal images. They're not literal matter at all. So the alchemists themselves had this idea. They knew that the prime matter was partly a symbolic, imaginative thing, and not just a literal thing. Whatever concrete matter they were using, it had this poetic, symbolic imagery attached to it, and so on. So I realized that the alchemical process, and in particular reflux distillation, was itself a sort of metaphor for the self-circling power of imagination, which has an unknown beginning, which transforms itself into something different, and yet it's all the same thing, really. It's always one. It's
Yeah.
one, yet it's many. So it describes the inner transformation of one's own soul, which we're given at birth. It's complete, but it also has to transform itself into,
Right.
and that's into something different. And Jung would say it has to transform itself into the self. So for him, it became a perfect image of individuation.
Right, right, right. Yeah, and while we're it's not even a digression into Jung. While we're mentioning Jung, my eyes really perked up when you brought up that quote or that notion from the what was the alchemical work that you said he was referencing?
Oh, Ruland's
Yeah,
lexicon. It's a
yeah,
dictionary of alchemical terms. You
yeah.
know, it
Sorry, this notion that there's like a star inside of man that is the imagination. This directly parallels one of the things Philemon says in the Red Book, where he's es- essentially explaining individuation for the first time from this esoteric Gnostic perspective, where he's saying, essentially, unless one fulfills the princip and forgive my Latin, unless one fulfills the principium individuationis and gives birth to a star, they essentially if they don't, they essentially disappear back into the pleroma. So
Sorry,
so there
who said that, Michael?
Philemon in the Red Book.
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Right.
and for me, this is always like deeply evocative of Plato's Timaeus, because when the demiurge is doing his thing and he's ordering the cosmos, there's this whole very alchemical sounding situation unfolding where he's essentially forging souls in this kind of um, a non-physical forge of some kind, where they talk about a corresponding star being created with every soul. So there's already this astro-theological uh you know correspondence based or sympathetic relationship between the individual human and some sort of uh non-physical light form. There's actually a Greek term for this. It's like Ogoedes Soma or something like this, like this light body. And and I always figured Jung must have been pulling from this because of course he read the Timaeus, but I didn't know there was also this direct correlation with alchemy about this notion of the individual imagination being like a star somehow.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And of course, there was actually some of the alchemists did in fact produce a physical star, and
Mm,
I've seen it actually. There's one in the Science Museum in London. It's called the Star of Antimony. But under certain circumstances, antimony forms itself, crystallizes into a beautiful silver star shape.
wow.
And that can occur naturally because I've seen the example in the museum. But some of the alchemists, because a lot of them used antimony, in fact, that would be my favorite. Antimony trisulfide or stibnite would be my favorite
Mm,
candidate for the prime matter,
interesting.
which you'd know, Michael, if you'd read on. But yes, so yes, so there is actually a physical correlate to this, and you can imagine if they were cooking metals for several years and this beautiful crystalline silver star emerged in the matter, how striking that would be! What a
Hmm.
symbol that would be when it occurs at the albedo.
Yeah, yeah.
So
And this archetype, and I mean this, I do want to return to this figure of Mercurius in general, because I just think it's just such rich, dangerous territory to explore. But all everything we're describing too really maps over what seems to be the Western esoteric imagination in general, that there's some sort of individual apotheosis or transformation that can occur through doing some kind of great initiatory work that has, whether it's something technical like alchemy, or it's undergoing initiate degrees until you suddenly realize that you're participating in this grand demiurgic uh, opera that's going on this planet and beyond. And I've always just been curious, how literal do you think Jung and the esotericists were being when they were talking about this kind of, because it strikes me as something that you either really do or you don't. it's something you really achieve or you don't. And I'm just wondering what your view is on that. Is it about the journey and the outcome doesn't really matter, or is there really some kind of rebirth and personal apotheosis that occurs within this, or as a result of undertaking this kind of a life?
Um, yeah, I think there is. I think alchemy wouldn't have persisted for 400 years if there weren't some real result. Um, I think I would put it more simply that it became apparent to me that much of alchemy was like was very like rites of passage.
Yeah.
Um, it's a striking fact that we moderns in the West are probably the only society who have more or less abandoned rites of passage. I
Yeah.
mean, we pay lip service to them, like we still get children christened in church and married in church, otherwise and buried in church. But otherwise, we never set foot in a church, So we still have a sort of faint idea that there are these stages of life: birth, puberty, marriage, and death. And alchemy, you can view alchemy in one way as exactly those transitions. That you start off with whatever you're working with, the prime matter and so on, which is the birth, or rather, the prime matter gives birth to the secret fire, um, and then your matter is it's more like a shamanic initiation. Your matter then has to be separated, dismembered. If you look at the illustrations to alchemy, the pictures, which are extraordinary symbolic pictures,
Hmm.
which are almost
Hmm.
incomprehensible to us, you see the king soul, the sun, who is the prime matter, being worked on, being dismembered by wild beasts or being pecked by eagles. They often bring in Greek mythology, they bring in Christian iconography, all sorts of things. And then you see the rebirth, and so on. But in the Christian model, you die and are reborn, as it were. That is the sort of mystical trajectory. But alchemy took it one step further. That the rebirth into the spiritual realm then has to be completed, whereby the spirit returns to the body and is embodied once again. So there's this conjunction of two incommensurables, spirit and matter,
Right.
which are forever incommensurable, divided, and yet magically. I mean, and it's a bit like, instead of just birth, death, rebirth, it's a bit like birth, death, rebirth, and resurrection,
Hmm.
as it were. That just as Christ actually physically resurrected, that is an image of the philosopher's stone and so on. He's Christ is never present in alchemical iconography. The symbols they use for the stone are things like um, the androgyne, the man
Yeah.
woman. You
Yeah. The
know,
rebus. The rebus.
the
Yeah.
yes, exactly. That sort of, which, or the hermaphrodite. A strange, unnatural being which
Hmm.
which is groping towards this impossible reconciliation of opposites and so on. So you could see alchemy as an accelerated process of sort of shamanic initiation in that way. Um, but that would only be one reading of it, simply because you could read alchemy into just about every transformational process,
Right.
because it was itself the Western transformational process par excellence. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. One of the reasons that I think, for it's one of those things you can really bang your head against the wall on, trying to figure out, is there really some kind of cohesive golden chain of techniques and philosophy that runs from, alchemy that people were doing in the 1600s back to like the Corpus Hermeticum or even Platonism. And to me, the answer I really think is yes, because you see this sort of um, you see very distinct sort of archetypal underpinnings, and here's a great example. You were talking about the rebus, and why would this thing be an image of being very close to perfection, right? Well, you could say, well, there's union of opposites, there's this, et cetera, et cetera. But if you go all the way back to the divine pymander, or what's the other more common name for it? Um,
The Asclepius? No.
I think that's a different one, but anyway, it's the one. It's the one where Hermes is having his whole vision of the divine logos. It shows up as this big cosmic dragon, and then it sort of proceeds to tell him everything about reality and how the cosmos was made, and it again tells a very similar sort of tale to Plato's Timaeus in more mystical terms. But one of the ideas that's talked about is actually one, there's sort of a kind of self-perfection that can occur, very similar to the alchemical magnum opus, very similar to Jung's individuation. But then the other really interesting thing is that he specifically, or it specifically says, that we descended from a different kind of being that actually was both male and female in one. And then there was this gradual just accretions that occurred throughout the ages to a point where we actually also physically split apart. And then it would make sense why, like hundreds or thousands of years later, we're still talking about that there's a kind of reintegration that would occur into that higher form in some sense that is symbolized by both the male and the female coming together.
In countless tribal myths, if there is one contradiction which occurs most frequently, it's the idea that the sky and the earth were once married and lay
Mm,
with each other,
mm,
and that they were separated. And the whole idea is to somehow get them to bring them together again, and so on, and things like that. And you could map that onto earth and sky can be female and male. And so, that's another image of the ultimate reconciliation of the incommensurable opposites, and so on. But I think there's no. I think that's the realm it belongs in is myth. That
mhm.
I think that I'm not sure we'll ever be able to do that. I'm
Yeah,
not sure
right.
we'll ever be able to reconcile. And in the Emerald Tablet, you have to
Yeah.
make that which is above like that which is below, and that which is
Yes.
below like that which is above. You know, which is the earth and sky conundrum
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
voiced more abstractly. But in a sense, that, and they always say that's where all our woe comes from, is from the separation of these two primordial principles, whether earth and sky or male and female, or any other pair of opposites you care to mention. Um, but I'm not sure that that's ever going to be possible. That even in the stone itself, there isn't a fusion of opposites. There is a containment of opposites in tension, that they remain separate yet connected. And I think that's the best we can hope for, if you see
Yeah.
what I mean. And
Yeah.
but I think those are the tensions all of us feel in ourselves, all the tensions that we feel growing up between our bodies and our spiritual aspirations, between our intellect and our emotions. I mean, we're absolutely torn by these things. All these things will never be raveled up into a single, uh, unless perhaps the saints at the end of their lives achieve this blessed
Mhm.
state. But it is possible to live with them in a state of tension, yeah,
Yeah.
or a state of equilibrium, tense, contained equilibrium, in which all the opposites are seen to be, in fact, just aspects of each other rather than things that oppose and pull apart. They're not a. Ian McGilchrist is very good on this. Do you know
Yeah.
who I mean? Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
he's very good on the idea of opposites not really being opposites. You know that they are a continuum, and you need the tenseness. And he often cites Heraclitus, who was marvelous. You know
Mm-hmm.
the idea of the bow, the bowstring. That, that unless it's in a state of extreme tension, it's useless. But when it's tense, and the lyre. Similarly, the lyre bends backwards and keeps the strings in tension. But without that, you can't play beautiful notes. And I think Heraclitus was bang on that is the desirable human state that we have to achieve. That what we perceive in ourselves as conflicts can be resolved and recast as tensions which are then profitable, can make music or let fly an arrow,
Right.
something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And I think that's part of Jung's key genius as well is when you turn this into, these impossible things into psycho-spiritual things, they're no longer impossible, right? Because you can have, I think, a literal anima encounter, for instance, where you truly feel like you have, as a male, integrated some sort of feminine version of self and vice versa. Um, and that turns it from this impossible, you know, thing that could never literally occur in the outside world, except through like a flawed idea, like, not saying marriage itself is flawed, but of course, like, you could argue that, well, that isn't that what marriage is. uh maybe to some degree, but how often does the perfect, hermetically symbolic marriage occur? Probably not very. um
Well, but marriage is probably the only. I think there are only two symbols of the blessed state, and marriage is one of them, in which
mhm.
the in which each person is more themselves as a
Yeah.
result of relating to the other than they would be on their own. And the image, and that's why all the great dramas, comedies, end in marriage, and all the fairy tales end in marriage. It is the archetypal symbol of the way in which opposites can achieve this state of separation yet connection in tension. And so the other one is musical. It's to do with being a voice in the choir, that
Mm.
you express yourself most individually, and yet you are part of a larger choir, which you're just a part, but you're also the whole, as it were. And the resulting thing is transcends each individual in the choir.
Yes.
That sort of image, yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know of any other. Well, I can't off the cuff think of any other great images. I think those images of marriage and choirs or orchestras is slightly better than the weird hermaphroditic icons of alchemy,
Yeah.
which.
Before we get too far away from this really difficult topic of Mercurius, there's this incredible Jung quote. I think it's from Psychology and Alchemy, where it's just a passage about Mercurius and all the different aspects and ways, Mercurius can appear. And I apologize. I have to pull this quote up, but I know I have it on my notepad somewhere, because it's just, in this context, it's too good not to not to share. And again, I wish I could have you read it, because your voice would be so much better for it. Um, the multiple aspects of Mercurius may be summarized as follows. 1. Mercurius consists of all conceivable opposites. He is thus quite obviously a duality, but is named a unity in spite of the fact that his innumerable inner contradictions can dramatically fly apart into an equal number of disparate and apparently independent figures. 2. He is both material and spiritual. 3. He is the process by which the lower in material is transformed into the higher in spiritual, and vice versa. 4. He is the devil, a redeeming psychopomp, an evasive trickster, and God's reflection in physical nature. 5. He is also the reflection of a mystical experience of the artifacts that coincides with the opus alchemicium. Six, as such, he represents on one hand the self and on the other the individuation process, and because of the limitless number of his names, also the collective unconscious. So it's like the container by which it all occurs, and the spirit. It's so hard to even begin to wrap your mind around that passage. Like I've read that passage probably a couple dozen times, and every time I read it, I still have trouble figuring out how all of this can be contained within one concept.
Yes, yes. No, no, I couldn't have put it better myself. But I did experience that. Anybody who researches alchemy deeply and tries to figure out what Mercurius is ends up where Jung is, really. That he's kind of, he's a bit like the Tao, kind of
Mm-hmm.
everything and nothing, and that he only appears in different images, opposing images, but never appears as himself, as it were. You can't get behind the image to what Mercurius is. In a sense, he is only composed only of images. So he's like a kind of a mirror.
Yeah.
A mirror could be full of images, but they're not there. You know. Um, yeah, I can't add to that, Michael. I can't even comment on it because it's true. But yes, I did feel that in the core of my being. I did feel that this is the but and also Jung makes the point too that in some sense alchemy was redressing the imbalance that all the alchemists were Christians, interestingly, and so on. But like Jung himself, who was kind of a Christian, but psychologically he was a polytheist.
Yeah, for sure.
Hillman's good on this, isn't he?
I love
Um,
Hillman. Yeah.
yeah, but Jung saw alchemy too as kind of completing the work that Christ failed to complete, which was he didn't redeem creation. The creation, as St. Paul says, groaneth and travaileth. That creation is what wasn't kind of redeemed in the way that humanity was. And Jung saw the work of alchemy as kind of as saving nature itself.
Yeah.
The completing the work of Christ, and that's why it never becomes too spiritual. That every time anything becomes too spiritual, there is, the volatile becomes fixed again. Um, the other great motto, the solve et coagula,
Mm-hmm.
dissolve and then coagulate. So everything, spirit and matter have to be kept closely at all times, that you're transforming the one into the other and back again and so on. And that's why I likened the stone to the resurrection. It's like the spirit, which is at last free. The rebirth has occurred. This is the mystical dream, the oneness with the one. Um, it then returns to the particular, the body, the concrete, just as Christ appeared to his disciples, the bit of the Bible it's hardest for us to believe. So
Yeah.
so in that sense, alchemy was working in the underworld, not in the spiritual
Right.
world, but kind of in the underworld, completing the work that Jesus, God bless him, missed out.
I can't believe I didn't ask you this earlier, but when I first brought up that passage that you open up Mercurius with, that you said Mercurius dictated to you, how what's that experience like? And was there anything that you did to sort of enter that state? Is it something that just sort of comes in a flash, or what is the phenomenology of that experience
I
like?
think I was in my third year of writing this bloody book. Um, when there was a famous storm in England in about 1986, and it was during the night of that storm, which was
Hmm.
it destroyed hundreds of thousands of trees. It's quite extraordinary. It was the only hurricane we've ever had, and it was during that night that I used to work at night and all night usually, and yeah, something strange happened to me that night. That my hands did start to move of its own accord, and I wrote stuff down that I that's in the book which I haven't touched.
Wow.
But I realized that Mercurius, that I'd earned my stripes just through laboring for 3 years. That I suddenly became transparent to Mercurius for a short while, and he wrote that down. And it was after that night that I thought this book needs an introductory quote, and I just wrote it down. So I kind of wrote it, but I knew that it was kind of that I couldn't have written that warning
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
before, because I knew that I was on the brink. That my tear-stained bits of empty paper were testimony to my having having qualified.
Wow.
So it was something like that, and I just dashed off that. I thought it needs some kind of introductory quote, and I just thought about it, and it came to me in one piece. Something like that. And I thought the warning was apt. Of course, I also hoped it would be a great. I thought it would be a good PR blurb as well, because there's nothing like warning people off to get them to read it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd rather have that for a book blurb than like something from Deepak Chopra or something. I'll take Mercurius over. Um,
Yeah.
that's so reminiscent of the story behind the Red Book as well. The story
Oh,
of
really?
Jung being in this place in his life where he had his falling out from Freud. His career was sort of in disarray. He felt like he was an outcast, and he was sitting in the middle of the night one night and hears a knock on the door, and he essentially just gets a psychic message saying something like, I think it's like, we're from Alexandria and we're not satisfied or something.
Oh,
And then
yes, yes, the
yeah,
seven sermons of the
yes,
dead. Yeah,
yes,
that's right.
yes, yes,
Yeah, the doorbell kept ringing, and there was no one there. And he said the house was full of spirits. He could feel it, and he was compelled to write this extraordinary Gnostic text, which was almost dictated to him, wasn't it?
yeah,
And then
yeah.
the atmosphere cleared, and all was well again. It was like a tremendous inner psychic pressure from the dead. I think he said,
Hmm.
we are the dead coming to, and
Yes.
we want to be acknowledged or heeded or whatever. Yeah, yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really enjoy I don't enjoy everything he says, but clearly he's brilliant. Kingsley in Catafalque really tries to argue that this is not a metaphor. Like the Red Book, what Jung is saying here, he really is. And he pulls all these quotes that really makes this a compelling idea that Jung was actually actually going into the underworld, actually channeling the dead, actually sort of having these archetypal images that you can see. I have the big copy of the Red Book on the top of the shelf. You probably can't see behind me, but these incredible works of art, like these are actually, you could call them alchemical, you could call them archetypal. I guess I would say they're probably both pieces of symbolic imagery that really do feel like images, like visions from an altered state of consciousness that are coming from, we could say inside, outside, conscious, unconscious, collective unconscious, whatever we want to put on them, but clearly coming from somewhere beneath ego consciousness, beneath consensus reality consciousness. And they still, I mean, for me and for so many other people, deeply resonate as some kind of, um, I don't know, some kind of information that's just soaked in kinds of meaning that we're all looking for. At least it's still palpable to me when I look at the Red Book.
Yes, yes, I quite agree. Yeah.
Do you feel like what percentage of Mercurius do you feel like came from that kind of a place? And do you think when you did hit those kinds of states of consciousness, do you think it was through pure initiatory writing like we were talking about before?
Um, it's not separate from just the general job of writing a novel, really. I mean, if you've not written a novel, you won't know that you never know what's coming from you and what's coming from well, perhaps also you, but at some deeper level, or not you at all, you know, as part of the excitement, really. And it's part of the pleasure of reading novels. You know, people who didn't exist now exist in your mind and can exist for you all your life, you know, as real people, but
Yeah.
they're fiction, you know. Um, but curious because it was partly non-fiction and partly fiction. What was an initiatory text for me, you know, because because I was grappling with an actual thing with alchemy, you know, and so yeah. But I wouldn't. There's no way you can say some this part came from somewhere else and this part I just made up. That's not how the imagination works. The whole point is it changed my view of the imagination. That it isn't a thing that just enables you to make up stuff.
Hmm.
It's a realm you enter into and which transforms you, and out of which you then speak or write. Um, but there are passages. I mean, there are humorous passages. Which
Hmm.
didn't come from the depths, or did they? Because that's part of Mercurius, who is always
Right.
duplex, if not quadruplex. He has many aspects. So duplicity is a part of Mercurius's his game, and so you play tricks on the reader too. You know, um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Um, you know,
I think the last word in the book is imagination,
mm,
but the preceding note, these are the notes that are compiled by me, um, is I think ambiguous. It tends to it says this may well just have been a work of imagination, as if that were nothing.
right.
But I mean something different by it too.
I'm
So
guessing. I'm guessing something similar to what we were discussing before, maybe in terms of the other understanding of imagination as perhaps this per, perfected kind of material, like psychic material that.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and in my case, it came out in concrete form as a
Hmm.
book.
Yeah, it's an incredible book. It's a really incredible book, and I do look forward to finishing it. One of the things I want to talk to you about properly before we wrap up is one of the other things that's so hooked into the Western esoteric worldview. Everything we're talking about in this sort of daimonic reality isn't just this notion of we live in a world that is a panoply of psychic forces, and these psychic forces are in everything, accompanying everything within us. Outside, there is no distinction. Is the idea of the personal daimon, and the personal daimon, again, regardless of if you're reading Plato's Timaeus, you're reading Jung, you're reading Soul's Code by Hillman, you're reading some kind of esoteric grimoire, communication or relationship to the personal daimon is of the utmost importance, and is often either harmonic with or literally the exact same thing in some cases as achieving something like a the goal of the alchemical great work. And I know you have many thoughts on this idea of the personal daimon. And I'm curious if you yourself feel like you've come to understand that relationship for yourself with your daimon.
uh, it's not really a thing you can understand. Um, I, I've talked at length on this subject with Bernardo Castrop,
Hmm. Hmm.
who's he's very conscious of his personal daimon in a way that I never have been. Um, but increasingly, if I look back on my life, it's made sense to me. That it's grown as a concept in my mind rather than diminished. Um, so yeah, that's what I'd say about that. Really, I mean, I thought it was just a fanciful idea of Plato's, really. But when I read the myth of
Yes.
in the Republic, um, a lot of things became clear to me. I thought, yes, actually, that is true to my experience. That I do seem to have been driven against my will to, or rather against my wishes, against my desires, to to perform the work, the opus contra naturam, the work against nature. It absolutely goes against every cell in my body screams out not to have to sit at a desk and write. You know, I'd rather do anything than that. But yes, I've been driven, as Jung says. Not that I would compare myself in any way to that great man, but he said, yeah, the daimon drove me ruthlessly,
Hmm.
to perform, you know, my life's task, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I'd encountered that earlier in I wrote a thesis when I was an undergraduate on W.B. Yeats, the poet.
Yeah.
And he's very good on the daimon because he speaks much more poetically than Jung, which is more to my taste. Things like the daimon can only be evoked poetically rather than, you know, classified and described minutely in technical detail.
Hmm.
It is, yeah. And I think it's probably true that we all do have a personal daimon. I think there's a book out now called by Charles Stang called,
Yeah.
is it
Divine
called the
double.
Divine Double? Yeah,
Hmm.
which I haven't read, but I think that also deals, doesn't it, with the idea of the heavenly twin who directs your life. Yeah.
Yep, yep. And I
Uh,
haven't read it either. It's been in my Amazon cart for a while, and I was in touch with him about doing one of these, and we haven't done it yet, but I would still love to. And yeah, my experience is the same as yours, Patrick. That it's not this overt. I want it to be this overt. I've had one overt experience in my life that I consider to probably be one of these daimonic experiences.
oh,
It
tell me,
it
tell
it
me.
well, it took 3 grueling nights on ayahuasca to get there. So so it was absolutely the type of thing where every single night was absolutely the sort of warning from Mercurius come to life, sort of, where I was just in this state of discomfort, of mental torment, of why the fuck am I doing this? What have I opened myself up to? I am being devoured by not like uh ho daimon, like my daimon, but like demons. Like that's what the experience felt like. Um until the third night I got out of this sort of underworld experience and found myself somehow in some sort of beautiful astral kind of environment of some kind, and it felt very much like a wise old man type presence, and what it communicated was nothing. It's not going to sound spectacular, but it just felt like the most pat on the head. You went through so much to get here. What can I do for you? And then sort of just realizing that I'm just this sort of like, I don't know, I just want to know the truth. I'm just a seeker. I'm just trying to understand this. And it was absolutely just almost like it must be what it feels like to pat your dog on the head and just say, you're doing a great job. Everything's okay. You're playing this Michael game. You're doing fine. And then what felt like gestured at the Milky Way. It felt like we were kind of under the night sky. And then he said, "And then you're going to play the infinity game." And that was pretty much it. But it was one of those things where I came out of it and I immediately went to my journal and just started writing. Never doubt that this happened. Just the profundity of it was so huge in the moment. And then, of course, as time goes on, you start to doubt it. You start to be like, "Well, I was on fucking ayahuasca, man. Like, come on." But
Yeah,
I still know deep down that that was an incredibly significant, powerful experience. But yes, other than that, it's been just like what you described. It's much more symbolic. It's much more in hindsight. It feels like everything had to work out this way. I'm almost like one of those people discussed in Soul's Code by Hillman, which if anyone wants to get their feet wet on this topic, I think Soul's Code is probably a good place to start.
Yeah, sure.
And by this, I mean, just early on in life, just feeling like I do not fit in. This is not for me. Why do people care about this? Why do people go to this church? Why do they want to do this for a living? I don't understand any of this. Just feeling like a, square peg in a round hole until just later in life and understanding again, as Hillman would say, what tree you're on. Like, okay, I fit in with these thinkers. Like I belong somewhere on a branch between Plato and Jung and Hillman and you. And then through that, you begin to start to understand what your daimonic place, mission, calling is. But it's this slow unfolding that really only makes sense in with hindsight, with events you never could have foreseen, with weird synchronicities and twists of circumstance and strange nebulous drives that you have to do things that you can't quite put your finger on. That's 100% how it works for me too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, well, you're in the golden chain, Michael. Yeah, which is
I'm,
a mixed blessing.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah,
Have you heard of the Monroe Institute?
sure. Yeah,
I asked because I did a retreat there about a year ago, and everybody who goes there wants to have an out of body experience. But for me, every single meditation, I was calling out to the daimon. I was saying like, I'm here. I want to commune. Never happened. The one thing that I felt like might have genuinely been a symbolic sort of image that I got during those meditations was I got a very persistent image of a clock. And I took it to mean that it was saying like when the time is right, not now. It was basically
or maybe
a
you're
not.
wasting your time.
It might have been that too.
Maybe time's running out. Life's too short for this.
Yes, right. And then what's funny is I got the thing that I didn't care about, and I actually got the full blown out of body experience on the last day of the retreat, to my great surprise, because I was not even sure if that was a thing. And
Right.
and
Yeah.
and, and to my surprise, it's definitely a thing.
Right.
Are you
Well,
working on a book now? Or sorry, sorry,
um,
sorry to interrupt you.
no, that's all right. Am I working on a book? Yes, but I'm not going to talk about it.
Not even a hint.
Um, More anthropology.
Hmm.
Yeah, I was very I was very seduced by Claude Lévi-Strauss.
Hmm.
Um, I talk about that a bit in my book, The Philosopher's Secret Fire, and the reason is this: that almost nothing about Lévi-Strauss attracts me. His background is in Marx, Freud, linguistic philosophy, and so on. But when he analyzes myths, it's sort of a magic thing that he takes two myths, two stories that look completely different, and then he shows you how, while the contents of the myth are completely different, the structure is exactly the same, but inverted. What it's up. One story is the upside down version of the other,
Hmm.
while still symmetrical with it. And he does this to show that how primitive thoughts, so-called primitive people, think is much more sophisticated than we think. He says they think just like us, that there's a logic in these myths. But I could see at once that it wasn't logic; it was analogic. That it was about analogies.
Hmm.
And he traces these myths one after the other across the Americas, from South America all the way up to North America, how each myth is kind of working towards reconciling opposites, which it never quite does. And so the structure of the next myth, the neighboring tribe has a myth that's the same structure, but inverted and symmetrical yet again and again and again. And it gave me a real insight, I think, which I'm not sure that people have noticed, which is it's how the imagination works. It's that we constantly, for example, we can. if you had a long sequence of dreams, my guess would be that they would be like personal myths, but the contents would look completely different. But I think the structure would be just like these communal myths, you know, that they would be constantly striving towards by inverting them, turning them upside down, changing all the signs within the story, so that mothers become sons and fathers become daughters, and eagles and become wolverines because the eagle is a creature of above, while the wolverine is a creature of the below because it burrows. So nothing looks the same as an eagle. An eagle and wolverine don't look at all the same. That's the content. But in the structure of the myths, you can see how they're all the time trying to bring above and below together by exhausting all the possible permutations of a set number of elements in the myth. And that struck me as being, a profound, and he demonstrates it by thousands of analyses of thousands of myths. And it fascinated me because I thought it gave me a real clue as to how imagination works. And I saw too how alchemy was that it was that that every circulation of the work, the contents look completely different. That one is about the sun and the moon, the other is about the king and the queen, but in fact they are and they are in fact just changing their signs, changing their meaning in at one level in order to be inverted and symmetrically at the next level, and so on. It's very hard to explain, but when you read Levi Strauss's analyses of myths, and you can do that, you could just read one or two in his essays, structural anthropology essays.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a magic trick. You look at these stories and think there's nothing in common, and then he shows you that they are. And so I got a real insight into how mythologies, that the myths within a mythology circulate and change, and that all these stories seem separate, but all the signs are all the structures are the same, but constantly inverted like mirror images of each other.
Hmm.
Um, I've said that very badly, Michael, but
No, well,
but
well,
but I want to pursue this a bit more, and so in my current writing, I'm trying to write something a bit more about the fundamental laws of imagination,
hmm,
which the imagination is my big topic. That
yeah.
is.
No, I think
I
that's,
belong to a tradition which says that our prime faculty is not reason; it's imagination, and that is what all the great thinkers I espouse believed. Jacob Boehme believed it. Marsilio Ficino believed that.
hmm, hmm,
Uh, Even Plato has a mythos strand in his work, and
yeah,
when he says, "I'm going to now tell you a story," um, that's when he goes into mythos mode, and his mythoi are fascinating stories,
yeah,
and so on, and Jung was in that tradition too. So
no
for all
doubt.
that, for all that he called himself a scientist and a rationalist, he was in fact a mad shamanic mystic, and he had to be initiated into imagination himself because he kind of didn't believe in its power, until, of course, alchemy came. He changed
Yes,
his mind. Yeah.
absolutely. No, that's incredibly fascinating and profound, and it points to something that I think overall, again, in a more macro way, sort of demonstrates this. When we were talking about trying to understand Mercurius earlier, I was thinking of the way overused blind men feeling the elephant sort of story. But it seems like it's that kind of a thing again, where through doing anything that brings order from chaos, whether it's writing a book, doing the alchemical great work, making sense of your life. It's like we don't have the faculty necessary to see the full thing, but clearly you can tell. I think if your mind is open and you're a remotely um, creative truth, like epistemically truthful person who's not trying to funnel everything down into some easy to understand worldview, is that there's some foundational teleological mystery there. And it may not be this really clean thing, like it's all one, to stretch the metaphor, elephant, but it's something. It's some kind of amorphous thing that is both destined and under construction at the same time. And there's this some level of open endedness, but some level of absolute, it is what it is sort of quality as well. And that in and of itself is one of the most mercurial things I can think of.
Yes, yes, no, I quite agree. I think the key word is mystery. You know that we we tend to treat mysteries as problems. Like UFOs. We think they're a
Yes, yes.
problem. That we think if we just apply enough science, we'll get the solution to that problem, but we won't. It's a mystery. And maybe that's what it's all about. In the end, it's reminding us that there are such things as mysteries and that there are no solutions to it. I'm not sure, but
Yeah.
yes, I agree that, and more, I see what I agree with what you're saying, that there's a sense in which one is. I never believed in fate, for instance, but I've come to believe that, yeah, that we are fated beings, but somehow or other that's not incompatible with free will,
Right.
you know.
Yeah,
But
and that's a great example of Plato himself playing this trickstery game, right? Because one of the most famous, it's on the, have you ever seen the Berkeley Plato bust that they think might, for a long time they believed it was fake and now they think it might be real?
the Berkeley,
The university Berkeley, they have a bust of Plato that they always assumed was a late replica of some sort, and then some specialist looked at it recently and said, "I think this could be genuinely ancient."
right,
And one of the quotes on it, I think, is from the Republic, and it says, and the quote in Greek is something like, um, "The gods are blameless, the fault lies with man," or something. And so, free will, right? Yet the myth of is all about, you've got this destiny, you've got this daimon who's keeping you bound essentially to the lot that the fates allotted to you, that you also kind of selected in the afterlife. So right there's that tension between,
yes. I mean, you
yeah,
chose your life freely. That's the point. And then the daimon makes sure you live it out. Yeah, yeah. So
yeah,
exactly, that contradiction is present at the very beginning. Yeah.
yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Well, I've greatly enjoyed this conversation, my friend. We're almost 2 hours in, and I really appreciate your time. What do you want to point people toward? What book, if anything, would you suggest to the audience?
Um, well, I'd be quite nice if they read some of my novels instead of always the non-fiction. So I wrote a sort of tetralogy of. There was Mercurius, which is partly fiction and partly not, and then I wrote Daimonic Reality to just sort out anomalies once and for all, which I failed to do because they're a mystery. And then and then I wrote The Philosopher's Secret Fire, which is a kind of mini history of the esoteric tradition. So it's a history of the imagination itself. And lastly, I wrote a book called The Secret Tradition of the Soul, or in England, A Complete Guide to the Soul, a very
Mm.
ambitious title,
Yeah.
over ambitious, some would say. So those are my four non-fiction books, but I've written well, I've still got in print about five novels, so I'd like people to read those instead,
Mm. Um,
especially the Savoy Truffle,
okay.
which is my autobiography.
Mm. I haven't even seen that one creeping
No, it's
around.
very, very obscure. That's why I'm annoyed that no one's reading it.
Yeah. Well, there some wealthy listeners going to buy up all the copies and create a secondary market and make it even.
Yeah,
Um,
probably. Yes. Are you going to write a book too, Michael?
I would really like to. I tried to a few years ago, and I got pretty deep into the process, and I just got to this point where I was like, this is garbage. Like I'm not ready yet. Um, so at some point
You
maybe,
have
but
to
as
power through that. Everybody thinks it's garbage, to start with.
in my case it was though. In
Oh,
my case it
okay.
really was. I think it was.
All right.
But yeah, someday I think yes. Right now I just don't feel like I could give it the quintessence it really deserves. But I think at some point, yes.
Well, you're doing good work. All your guests are very interesting people, so
I really appreciate that. I
giving
really
them a
appreciate that.
voice, which is nice. Yeah.
I'm trying. I'm trying. And I'm very, very grateful and happy to give you a voice. It's one of my favorites. And I think you might be the only author I can think of who has the problem of their nonfiction is the really popular thing, and then their fiction is the things that's less read.
Yeah.
But I think it speaks to the fact that Daimonic Reality is really scratching an itch in the collective consciousness right now, because people are looking deeper at high weirdness, the UFO phenomenon. And to me, that this is the answer. And like I said, I I had arrived at that even before knowing you existed or reading that book. And stumbling upon it is just like, oh, here it is. The person that and that's part of the reason I don't feel like I need to write a book, is because like
Yeah, it's
that
always nice when you read a book that you can't be asked to write yourself. Yeah,
exactly.
it's
Yeah,
great.
you got to it way before me. You
I
got
know
to it way before me.
that happens to me a
Yeah.
lot. Luckily, yeah, things like I've written the antidote to Daimonic Reality as well, which
Mm.
is which is a novel about the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard.
Oh yeah.
He was an either or man. You see, Daimonic Reality is very much both and, but Kierkegaard was either or. So yeah,
And
uh,
what book is that?
it's called the Stormy Petrel.
Okay. Eh,
Not petrol as in gas, but petrel as in the bird. A stormy
Oh.
petrel is a kind of bird. That's how he described himself. He's as a kind of outcast figure. It's supposed to, the bird is supposed to appear before storms, so it's a kind of harbinger of storms. He thought of himself in that way, and
Mm.
he was right. Anyway, I just throw that in. If
Yeah, very
anybody's interested
fascinating.
in reading about Kierkegaard, a nice, easy to read version of Kierkegaard, because it's a
Yeah.
novel, not a technical philosophical book. And that's the one for them to start with. So there we go.
Well,
All right.
I for one am interested, my friend. And thank you again for your time. I think your philosophical picture that you have outlined throughout your work is unbelievably rich, and something that I'm going to continue joyfully digesting for a long time.
Well,
So
I
thank you
agree.
for all your work, my
I
friend.
agree, but I've only scratched the surface. There's much work to be done. So everybody can join in and flesh out the daimonic reality, which I barely touched on. Yeah.
That's always the feeling. That's always the feeling. I love it.
Yeah. Okay, Michael. Nice to talk to you.
You too.